Um, so, what are the conditions for the acceptance of Tafseer Ishaaree? Ibn al-Qayyim mentioned the following conditions for its acceptance. It should not conflict with the Zahir meaning. In other words, the literal meaning of those passages. The Qur'an, as it frequently states, was revealed in clear Arabic. So the clear meaning that any speaker of the language would understand from those verses, that is the primary intended meaning. So if somebody comes with a symbolic meaning that conflicts with that, it's rejected. So, and that mention of the Qur'an being revealed in clear Arabic, I mean, one of the passages that mentions that is Surah Al-Shu'ara, verse 195, which we've mentioned already. Second, the interpretation should be a valid meaning in and of itself. So, well, what does that mean? Well, other scholars mention an explanation of that, and we'll come to that in a minute. Third, the Quranic wording should hint at the Ishaaree meaning. It has to be some kind of linguistic something, some kind of connection somehow to the symbolic interpretation. And four, there should be a strong connection, irtibat wa talazum, between the ayah and the Ishaaree meaning. So Az-Zarqani clarified some of that, and he made some other conditions. First, no claim should be made that this Ishaaree meaning is the primary intended meaning, or even worse, to say that it is the only meaning. And the ta'wil should not be far-fetched. An example of a far-fetched ta'wil is وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ لَمَعَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. The term لَمَعَ, it's lam al-qasam with the word ma'a, which means with. So verily, there's an oath there, the hidden oath. Verily, by Allah, Allah is with those who do good. In Surah Al-Ankabut, verse 69, the last verse. Somebody interpreted lama'a to mean enlightened, a past tense verb, lama'a. Now again, I didn't plumb the depths of the meaning, but when you look at a basic Arabic English dictionary like Hans Ware, lama'a is an intransitive verb. It means actually to glisten or to shine. And it doesn't take on the transitive meaning unless you turn it into a form 2 verb like lamma'a, or I guess al-ma'a, which would mean to illuminate, or to make shine, to polish. So, that's a really far-fetched interpretation. And another example of that, the hadith of Jibreel, where the Prophet ﷺ is being asked to interpret al-ihsan. And he says, al-ihsan is to worship Allah as if you see Him. فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ تَرَاهُ فَإِنَّهُ يَرَاكَ. If you don't see Him, then He sees you. Now, the Arabic has the word takun, in lam takun tarahu, and when you translate it, it becomes a bit clumsy to translate that word takun. You could say in lam tarahu yarak. If you don't see him, he sees you. But takun is added to give the sense that not being able to see him is an ongoing state. Anyway, one Sufi interpretation of that was id lam takun means if you cease to exist in your own perception, you lose the consciousness of yourself. In lam takun, if you cease to exist, tarahu, then you will see him. And what that does is it violates the rules of Arabic grammar, because that's a conditional statement, and they've turned it now into a situation where the second half of the condition, the answer, and jawab al-shart in Arabic grammar, the second half is he sees you. I'm sorry. The second half is that you will see him, and if you cease to exist in your own perception, then you will see Allah. So, and then what is the real jawab al-shart? If you don't see him, then he sees you. It sort of becomes some sort of like appendix added to the sentence and doesn't really have much meaning. But the rules of jawab al-shart is that it should be majzoom, and so the alif should drop out. فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ, and that's majzoom. Tarahu. It should be tarahu, but it's not. It's tarahu. So, that's an extremely forced, imposed meaning upon the text, and it just doesn't work grammatically. And then Az-Zarqani goes on to say that the ta'wil should not oppose that which is some other text in the Sharia, and it should not be, it should not fly in the face of logic. It should not be completely irrational. And then he adds a final point, which is that there must be some corroboration for it somewhere else in the Sharia. So you have to have corroboration, and you cannot have conflict. Now, if we look at some examples of Tafseer Ishaaree. So do not set up rivals to Allah when you know better. فَلَا تَجْعَلُوا لِلَّهِ أَنْدَادًا وَأَنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ. Verse 22 of Surah Al-Baqarah. Sahl al-Tustaree, who is one of the prominent Soofee scholars of the 3rd century, was born at the very beginning of it, in the year 200 after the Hijrah, and he died in 283, which would correspond to 896 of the Common Era. So in his commentary, he has a commentary on the Qur'an that's commonly known as Tafsir al-Tustaree, but apparently the title is Tafsir al-Qur'an al-Azeem. And it's only selected verses that he comments on. So in commenting on this verse, he said, the term rivals, what's been translated here as rivals, and dad, he said the greatest of rivals is the lower self, an-nafs al-ammara bis-su', which is in constant pursuit of its desires, hudud, and its share. It wants in whatever you're doing, it wants its share. So it's in constant pursuit of its desires without guidance from Allah. Al-Dhahabi, who quotes that in Tafsir wal-Mufassirun, he comments, he says, this statement gives the impression that the soul is a member of the general linguistic indicator of andad, rivals. So that if the meaning were explained in detail, it would be, don't set up rivals with Allah, not an idol, not a demon, not your own self, etc. And Al-Dhahabi found that problematic on some level. If one adheres to a strictly linguistic analysis, I had a bit of difficulty understanding what his problem with that was. Apparently his problem with it is that if you look at the passage, and before and after, it doesn't directly deal with idol worship in any way. And the address is Ya Ayyuhan Nas, O humanity. He understands from that who is really being addressed here is the mushriks. And that in the context of situation in which the verse was revealed, that it's the mushriks in the Arabian Peninsula were idol worshippers. And so he said the Arabs didn't worship the human soul or the ego overtly. They didn't direct devotions to it in the way they did to idols. But he goes on to find a basis for accepting or accommodating this explanation from a certain angle. He says, one who studies the Qur'an may take the primary meaning of the verse as a basis for further contemplation. Primary meaning here is that rivals is any objects of direct worship, such as idols. If one studies the Qur'an and takes the primary meaning of the verse as a basis for further contemplation and applies it to matters the verse did not explicitly address due to similarities between them. So in other words, he's talking about a process of what the fuqaha would call qiyas, analogy. So you're taking what the verse is explicitly about and then extracting a general meaning and applying it to something that shares in that general meaning. The reality is that the human psyche does sometimes, or frequently, act in opposition to the will of Allah and is, in that sense, a rival to Allah. And then he goes on to say there are other passages that add to the weight of this interpretation. For instance, speaking about the Jews and the Christians, اتخذوا أحبارهم ورهبانهم أربابا من دون الله. They took their priests or their rabbis and their monks as lords besides Allah. And Surah Tawbah, verse 31. So he says the way the Jews and Christians did this was not by making them the objects of devotional worship, but in obeying the rabbis and monks in their declarations of halal and haram, when they knew their statements to conflict with the rules that were in the scripture. And by doing so, they took the priests, monks, and rabbis as rivals with Allah. And the motive of these monks and rabbis in making those declarations was hudud al-nafs, their egotistical craving for wealth, power, advantage, something. And that anybody who makes for himself something lawful that Allah has declared unlawful, or vice versa, due to these promptings of the lower self, then they're engaged in the same kind of process as those who are named in the verse. And then he says another angle of corroboration can be found in Umar ibn al-Khattab when he quoted a verse that was revealed about the disbelievers to some of the Sahaba. This was after Allah had opened for the Sahaba the doors of worldly abundance. And so he saw them, he considered them to be overindulgent in al-mubah, that which is lawful, but there's no reward in it per se, the morally neutral. So he considered them to be overindulging in those good things of the world. And he said, where will this verse take you? أذهبتم طيباتكم في حياتكم الدنيا. You have squandered your good things in the life of the world. Surah Al-Ahqaf, verse 20. Now, this verse is undeniably about the disbelievers because it starts out, translation, on the day those who rejected faith are exposed to the fire. It will be said, you squandered the good things. And so from Dhahabi's angle of reasoning, if verse 22 of Al-Baqarah was primarily addressing the mushrik Arabs, then to apply that to believers also, humanity in general, is warranted because it's a similar tafsir strategy to that of almost. Another example, also from Sahl al-Tustaree, And we said, O Adam, dwell you and your wife in paradise, and eat thereof freely wherever you will. But do not approach this tree, lest you become wrongdoers. Verse 35 from al-Baqarah. So, al-Tustaree, he commented, he says, in reality, Allah did not intend the prohibition to be directed toward eating. What he really intended was for aspiration to be attached to other than Allah, to settle on other than Him. That is, do not concern yourself with anything other than me, Adam. Anything other than me. Adam, Tustaree continues, he says, Adam, peace be upon him, was not able to avoid the aspiration and the act, in other words, of eating or approaching the tree, in paradise, as a result of which the ensuing consequences overtook him. Likewise, anyone who lays claim to that which is not his and takes it to heart due to the caprices of his lower self, the consequences that Allah leaves him to that which his self is naturally inclined, unless Allah has mercy upon him and protects him for his own, or protects him from his own tadbir and his plans and his machinations, and gives him help against his enemy, that is, the lower self. And then he goes on to say that Adam's heart was not protected after his entry into paradise from the inclination to make his own arrangements to secure immortality. Don't you see that the trial came to him by way of his heart's inclination to the whisperings of his lower self, and as a result, whim and desire overcame knowledge and the intellect, and what had been made clear to him, and the light in the heart. So his whims and caprices, they overcame all these things. And all that was fulfillment of a primordial destiny from Allah the Exalted. As he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so he's attributing a statement to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whims and desire can overcome knowledge and the intellect. I looked for that hadith in the software program. Somebody made a program of al-Albani's books. I didn't see any mention of it. And I've never heard of that hadith before. Anyway, al-Dhahabi commented that Tustaree's explanation conflicts with that of the rest of the Mufassirun. They all say that the prohibition was from actually eating from the tree. But then al-Dhahabi goes on, he says it's possible to accommodate Tustaree's explanation in that the wording of the prohibition was do not approach this tree. And the point of the prohibition was certainly not the approach itself. There's not any Mufassir that says that the approach was the intent of the prohibition. So it's clear from that that the prohibition was directed at something else. There was something else that was the point. And so either that would be because approaching the tree would lead to eating from it, or to some other meaning that was associated with the approach that would give rise to the eating. And that other meaning could be interpreted as what al-Tustaree said, which was attaching one's aspirations to other than Allah. So, because Adam, he ate from that tree due to a meaning in the tree that he perceived in the tree, that it would become the means to securing his immortality, and he went about securing what he considered to be a benefit because he saw this tree to contain that benefit, despite the fact that Allah had prohibited him from it. And if his heart had been attached to Allah, he would have refrained from the prohibition. But it became attached to other than Allah. And so, there is a psychological basis for Sahl's interpretation.